David Bowie and Freddie Mercury, nearly destroyed under pressure, then created a masterpiece, Montreux, Switzerland. Mountain View Studio, July 1981. Two of rock's biggest egos stood on opposite sides of a mixing board, voices raised, fingers pointing. David Bowie had just called Freddie Mercury's vocal approach too operatic for what this song needs. Freddie had responded by suggesting Bowie's idea was boring as death. The engineer stopped the tape. The room went silent except for the hum of equipment. Then Freddie did something nobody expected. He grabbed his jacket and walked toward the door. "Where are you going?" Roger Taylor asked. "Anywhere Bowie isn't," Freddie replied. What happened in the next 8 hours would either create one of rock history's greatest collaborations or destroy a friendship before it could begin. And the song that emerged from that chaos, a bass line that John Deacon almost deleted, vocals that weren't supposed to work together, and a creative battle that nearly ended in both stars walking out, would become the only #1 hit either artist would achieve together. This is the story of Under Pressure, not the polished version, you know. The messy, ego-driven, nearly catastrophic truth of how two legends almost killed their masterpiece before it could be born. By summer 1981, both David Bowie and Queen were at interesting crossroads. Bowie had just released Scary Monsters, widely considered a creative peak. Queen had completed The Game and were riding high on massive American success. They weren't supposed to be recording together. It happened almost by accident. Queen was in Montreux working on what would become Hot Space. Bowie happened to be in town, staying at the nearby Montreux Palace Hotel. He'd worked with Brian May before Brian had contributed guitar to Bowie's recordings earlier that year. The relationship was friendly, professional, respectful. So when Bowie stopped by the studio one evening just to say hello, it felt natural for someone to suggest, "Why don't we try jamming something?" That something started as a simple groove. John Deacon laid down a bass line he'd been toying with, a walking, almost funky pattern that built tension through repetition. Roger Taylor added drums. Brian May contributed guitar textures. It felt good, promising, the kind of spontaneous magic that happens when talented musicians stop overthinking and just play. Then Bowie and Freddie both stepped up to the microphone, and that's when the complications began. The initial concept seemed straightforward enough. Two distinctive voices trading lines, creating conversation through song. But Freddie Mercury and David Bowie didn't just have different voices, they had completely different philosophies about what vocals should accomplish. Freddie approached singing like opera, big, dramatic, emotionally overwhelming. Every line was a chance to showcase range, power, emotional intensity. Subtlety was for people with smaller voices. Bowie approached vocals like an actor, restrained, textured, using unusual phrasing and deliberate flatness to create tension. Drama came from what you didn't do, not what you did. These approaches could complement each other beautifully, or they could clash catastrophically. The first vocal takes were promising. Bowie sang the opening verse with his characteristic controlled intensity. Freddie came in for the next section and immediately went bigger, more volume, more vibrato, more everything. Bowie listened to the playback, expression unreadable behind his cigarette smoke. Then, "That's too much, Fred. This song needs space to breathe. You're filling every gap." Freddie's eyebrows went up. "Space to breathe? David, this isn't a whisper session. The song has passion. It needs voice. It has voice. It needs control. I am controlled. You're controlled like a hurricane is controlled." The room got very quiet. Brian May and Roger Taylor exchanged glances. They'd seen Freddie in creative disagreements before. This was heading somewhere tense. But Freddie, to his credit, tried a different approach. Next take, he pulled back, used less vibrato, sang closer to Bowie's dynamic range. Bowie listened to the playback, head tilted, analyzing, nodded slowly. "Better, but now you sound like you're trying to sing like me," which defeats the entire purpose of having Freddie Mercury in the room. Freddie's patience cracked. "Well, what exactly do you want, David? I pull back, it's wrong. I push forward, it's wrong. Perhaps you should just sing the whole bloody thing yourself." "Perhaps I should," Bowie said quietly, stubbing out his cigarette with deliberate calm that was somehow more cutting than anger. That's when Freddie stood up and grabbed his jacket. Roger Taylor would later describe the moment as watching a bomb timer hit zero and just waiting for the explosion. Except Freddie didn't explode. He simply walked out, closing the door with perfect control, which was somehow worse. After Freddie left, the studio settled into uncomfortable silence. Roger Taylor lit a cigarette, hands not quite steady. Brian May adjusted his guitar needlessly, fingers looking for something to do. John Deacon sat at the bass, expression neutral, but fingers still moving on the strings, playing that bass line over and over almost unconsciously, like a nervous habit. Bowie stood at the mixing board, arms crossed, staring at the tape reels as they continued spinning pointlessly. The engineer finally spoke, voice careful. "Should I save what we have or—" "Save it," Bowie said. Then, after a pause where everyone could hear him thinking, "Where does Freddie usually go when he's angry?" "Bar at the Montreux Palace," Roger said. "Or he walks along the lake. Sometimes both." Bowie grabbed his coat. "I'll find him." Brian stopped him with a hand on his shoulder. "David, Freddie, when he's angry, he needs time, space. He needs to process before he can hear reason." "I don't care about managing his anger," Bowie replied, shrugging off the hand. "I care about finishing this song. Because what we have is good. It could be great, but only if we both stop trying to win." He walked out, leaving the door open behind him. Cold Swiss mountain air rushed in. Brian and Roger looked at each other across the mixing board. "This is either brilliant or a disaster," Roger muttered, crushing out his cigarette. "With these two?" Brian replied, already reaching for his guitar to keep his hands busy. "Probably both." Bowie found Freddie exactly where Roger predicted, sitting at the bar of the Montreux Palace, glass of vodka already half empty, staring out at Lake Geneva where moonlight created a silver path across dark water. He sat down on the adjacent bar stool without asking permission, without apologizing for following, without acknowledging the tension at all. Freddie didn't look at him, just kept staring at the lake. "Come to tell me I'm too much again?" "No," Bowie said, signaling the bartender. "Come to tell you I'm an asshole." That got Freddie's attention. He turned, eyebrows raised, vodka glass paused halfway to his lips. Bowie ordered a drink before continuing. "I spent the last 20 minutes walking here thinking about why I was so irritated, and I realized it wasn't about your singing. Your singing is extraordinary. It was about control." "Control of what?" "The song, the session, the collaboration, the narrative." Bowie took a sip of whatever the bartender had poured. "I'm used to being the primary creative voice in any room I enter. You're used to being the primary creative voice in any room you enter. We both walked into that studio tonight assuming our way was the right way, that our vision should dominate." Freddie considered this, swirling vodka in his glass. "Your way is boring. Your way is overwhelming. So we're at an impasse." "Or," Bowie said slowly, staring at the same moonlit lake, "we're at an opportunity. What if the song needs both? What if the tension we're creating personally is exactly what the song should be about?" Freddie raised an eyebrow. "You're suggesting our inability to work together is the point?" "I'm suggesting," Bowie said, turning to look at him directly, "that a song called Under Pressure should probably sound like two forces pushing against each other, not two voices singing in perfect harmony. The pressure is the point." Freddie was quiet for a long moment, processing. Then, "You manipulative bastard. You just turned our creative fight into a conceptual framework." Bowie smiled slightly. "Is it working?" "Unfortunately, yes." Freddie drained his vodka. "You realize this means neither of us gets to win." "I'm realizing," Bowie replied, "that might be the only way we both win." They walked back to the studio together just after midnight. The path along the lake was quiet except for their footsteps and distant water against shore. Neither spoke, but something had shifted. The competitive tension hadn't disappeared, it had transformed into something potentially useful. The rest of Queen was still there when they entered, half expecting them to return separately or not at all. Brian looked up from his guitar. Roger crushed out another cigarette. John Deacon's fingers finally stopped moving on the bass. "Right," Freddie announced, walking in with renewed energy. "We're doing this properly. David sings his way. I sing my way. We don't try to match. We don't try to blend. We push against each other. The song is about pressure. Let's make it feel like actual pressure. What followed was one of the most intense recording sessions anyone present would ever experience. They rebuilt the song around conflict as concept. Bowie would sing a line with restraint, almost talking the melody. Freddie would answer with power, transforming the same words into something urgent and desperate. Where Bowie pulled back, Freddie pushed forward. Where Bowie left space, Freddie filled it. But instead of fighting for dominance, they were creating conversation, argument, dialogue between two people trying to communicate under impossible circumstances. The session stretched past 3 a.m. Someone ordered food that went cold and uneaten. Coffee cups accumulated around the mixing board. The tape rolled and rolled and rolled. John Deacon's bass line, the one he'd almost suggested deleting earlier because it felt too repetitive, became the foundation that held these contrasting vocals together. That walking, building pattern created forward momentum while giving both voices room to exist without destroying each other. Brian May's guitar work stayed deliberately minimal, adding texture without competing for space. He understood instinctively that this song needed to breathe, needed gaps between the vocal intensity. Roger Taylor's drums drove forward relentlessly, refusing to let the tension resolve into comfort. Every fill pushed the energy higher. By 3 a.m., they had something raw and powerful and completely unlike anything either artist had done before. By 5 a.m., they had a complete track that made everyone in the room go silent when they heard the final playback. By 6 a.m., Bowie and Freddie were sitting outside the studio on the loading dock, watching the sun rise over Lake Geneva, exhausted and slightly drunk on champagne someone had opened. That, Freddie said, voice hoarse from hours of singing, was the most difficult and most satisfying thing I've done in years. Same, Bowie replied, lighting what might have been his 20th cigarette of the night. We should never do it again. Absolutely never. The egos can't survive it. Completely unsustainable. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching mountains emerge from darkness as dawn arrived. Then Freddie added, though it is rather brilliant. It is rather brilliant, Bowie agreed. Under Pressure was released in October 1981. It went to #1 in the UK, Bowie's third chart topper, Queen's second. The creative tension that nearly destroyed the session became the song's defining characteristic. Critics called it urgent, powerful, two titans in perfect conflict. They had no idea how accurate that description was. Years later, Brian May would describe that session as watching two alpha wolves trying to share territory. It shouldn't have worked. By all logic, it should have been a disaster. Two people that strong-willed, that certain of their vision, there should have been blood on the studio floor. Roger Taylor was more direct. I genuinely thought one of them would throw a punch at some point. Instead, they created something neither could have done alone. That's the thing about real artists when they fight. They fight with music. The song's legacy grew over decades. The bass line became one of rock's most recognizable. The song would appear in countless films and TV shows. New generations would discover it and marvel at how two such different voices could create such cohesive power. But people who were in that Montreux studio in July 1981 knew something the public didn't. The song almost didn't exist, was nearly destroyed by the same creative tension that ultimately made it extraordinary. Bowie and Freddie remained friends but never recorded together again. Both cited Under Pressure when asked why not. Once you create something that perfect through that much conflict, Freddie said in a 1985 interview, you don't tempt fate twice. That session nearly killed us both, in the best possible way. Bowie was characteristically more philosophical. Some collaborations are lightning strikes. You don't try to recreate lightning. You appreciate that it happened at all, and you walk away while you're both still standing. When Freddie died in November 1991, Bowie was asked about Under Pressure and what Freddie had meant to him. His response was simple but devastated. We fought like hell to make that song, and I'd give anything to fight with him one more time. The truth about great art is that it rarely comes from perfect harmony. Sometimes it comes from talented people pushing against each other so hard that something new emerges in the pressure between them. That Montreux studio session could have ended in disaster. Two massive egos, completely different approaches, both absolutely certain they were right. Instead, it ended in magic. Not despite the conflict, but because of it. Because pressure, properly applied, doesn't just break things. Sometimes it creates diamonds. And under pressure is exactly that, a diamond formed from creative friction, ego collision, and two artists who were brilliant enough to recognize that their differences weren't destroying the song. Their differences were the song. 40 years later, that bass line still stops people in their tracks. Those contrasting vocals still create tension and release. The song still sounds like exactly what it is: two forces pushing against each other, creating something neither could make alone. That's the real story of Under Pressure. Not a smooth collaboration, not two friends in perfect sync, but two titans fighting for their vision, and somehow through vodka and moonlight and stubbornness and mutual respect, they barely admitted to having creating something greater than either vision alone. That's not just music history. That's proof that sometimes the hardest path leads to the best destination, and that when two legends collide, you don't step back and let one win. You lean into the collision and see what emerges from the impact. What emerged was unforgettable.